You'd think a missing police officer would be found by his fellow humans, right? But what if I told you that a retired K9 hero, long out of service, was the one who found him, and in doing so, uncovered a chilling secret the town had been hiding for years? Before I tell you what this K9 did next, can I ask you something small? If you believe no one should face darkness alone, please tap that subscribe button. Most people scroll past stories like this, but your one click could help this story reach someone who truly needs it. Please consider subscribing to the channel. Your support makes a difference. It started like any other day in the small town of Rockford. Officer Mike Daniels had clocked in early that morning, preparing for a typical shift. It was a quiet town, the kind where everyone knew everyone, and crime was generally low. But Mike's role was anything but mundane. As part of the town's elite tactical team, Mike had been involved in some of the most dangerous and challenging cases. Shootouts, high-speed chases, and criminal investigations were part of his daily grind. Mike had never shied away from danger. If anything, he thrived in it. The adrenaline of his work was something he'd grown accustomed to. But this day, something was different. The early hours were uneventful. There were the usual reports, noise complaints, routine patrols, the occasional traffic stop, but nothing too serious. Mike had spent his morning chasing down leads on a string of recent break-ins in the area. A few homes had been ransacked, and a couple of businesses were targeted too. Nothing had been stolen that couldn't be replaced, but the violation of safety was enough to put the town on edge. Mike had been following up on a potential suspect, a man known to have been spotted near the locations of the break-ins, and it seemed like he was getting closer to a breakthrough. But by the time the clock ticked past dusk, something had gone terribly wrong. Mike was supposed to check in with his team around 5 p.m., but his radio fell silent. This wasn't like Mike. He was always prompt with updates, especially when he was on a lead. His team initially thought maybe he was in an area with poor signal, but when they called again and again, each attempt went unanswered. Then they received an alert, a distress signal from Mike's radio. It was faint, filled with static, but unmistakably his voice. "I'm near the swamp, something's off." That was the last anyone heard from Officer Mike Daniels. The swamp wasn't a place anyone ventured into unless they absolutely had to. It stretched for miles, dense with trees and fog, a labyrinth of murky waters and dense brush. It was easy to get lost, and harder to find your way out once you did. The swamp had been the site of many search and rescue missions over the years, and while it was never a place to wander aimlessly, it was also a place no one would expect an officer like Mike to disappear in. He knew the land like the back of his hand, and he was a seasoned officer. If something had happened, it wasn't likely to be simple. The possibilities swirling in the air were many. Could Mike have gotten hurt? Was he ambushed? Or had he, perhaps, stumbled into a more sinister trap? By nightfall, the search teams were mobilized. The police, the search and rescue dogs, even a helicopter, all were dispatched to cover the swamp. But nothing, no sign of Mike, no trace of his scent, no indication of where he had gone. The only thing they found were his footprints, which had led into the dense thicket of trees and brush that bordered the swamp. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood, nothing that suggested foul play, yet everything felt wrong. The small town of Rockford had gone from calm to frantic in a matter of hours. Mike had been a pillar of the community for over a decade, and his disappearance left an entire town on edge. No one knew if he was dead or alive. His family was frantic, his friends devastated. Yet, there was a lingering feeling, a sense of dread that couldn't be shaken. The search continued for days. Officers, volunteers, even local hunters joined in. They combed every inch of the swamp, looking for any clue, anything that might explain where Mike had gone or what had happened to him. At times, it felt like they were looking for a ghost. They were walking over the same ground, retracing the same steps, but still, no sign of Mike. Rumors began to spread. Some of the more superstitious locals whispered that the swamp was cursed, that it had a way of claiming those who ventured too deep into its heart. Others suggested Mike had been ambushed by someone. Maybe the criminal he'd been tracking had set a trap for him. Perhaps he'd been taken by a group of poachers who frequented the swamp, setting traps to catch wildlife, but instead, catching someone far more dangerous. But there was one theory that no one dared to speak aloud, that Mike hadn't just disappeared by accident. Some people believed Mike had uncovered something far darker than just a simple criminal, something that had forced someone to silence him. There was even talk that Mike had been too close to exposing something within the police department itself. But again, no one said it out loud. After all, Mike had been a trusted officer for over 10 years, and the idea of him being involved in anything criminal was unfathomable. Axel, the retired K9, had been living peacefully at home for the past few months. The once vibrant and fierce working dog, who had been Mike's partner for years, now spent his days lounging on the couch or lying on his bed. Axel had retired just a few months before Mike disappeared, his body aching from years of intense training and service. He had saved lives, many lives, during his time in the field, from sniffing out drugs to finding missing persons. Axel was a hero in his own right, but Axel wasn't just any dog. He had a bond with Mike that transcended words. It was a connection forged in the heat of battle, in the quiet moments after a successful mission, in the unspoken trust that developed over years of working side by side. Axel knew Mike better than anyone, and vice versa. Their partnership had been legendary. They were more than just a team. They were family. Axel had retired gracefully, slipping into a quiet life in the comfort of Mike's home. But when Mike's family heard that Axel was still in good health, still sharp, they made a call to the authorities, urging them to bring the dog in for the search. At first, there was resistance. Axel was retired. He had served his purpose. Could he still be of any use? Would he be able to track the scent after all this time? Could a retired dog really make a difference in finding a missing officer? Despite the doubts, Axel's previous handlers insisted that he had something no human officer could match: instinct. And that instinct, honed over years of police work, had never left him. If anyone could find Mike, it was Axel. Axel wasn't a young dog anymore. His body had begun to show signs of wear and tear, the result of a career that had demanded everything from him. His legs ached, his joints stiffened, and his once razor-sharp senses weren't as sharp as they had been. But even though Axel had retired, it was impossible to ignore the bond he shared with Mike. Everyone knew that if there was even a chance that Axel could find Mike, it was worth trying. The decision to put Axel back into action wasn't just a professional one, it was personal. For Mike's family, it felt like the only hope they had left. They couldn't bring themselves to believe that Mike was gone, not without a fight, not without one last chance. And so, Axel was brought out of retirement. It wasn't long before the retired K9 was standing at the edge of the swamp, his nose sniffing the damp air. His ears perked up as he sensed the familiar smells of the land he once patrolled with Mike. The swamp had always been an area Axel knew well. It was a place where he and Mike had spent countless hours, searching for criminals, tracking down lost hikers, and occasionally rescuing animals in distress. As Axel stood at the edge of the dense swamp, the others could see the determination in his eyes. He was ready, more than ready. This wasn't just about finding Mike anymore. This was personal. This was about a bond, about loyalty, and about a dog doing whatever it took to bring his partner home. Axel wasn't just searching for a missing officer. He was searching for a truth, for something that no one had anticipated. And as the team ventured deeper into the swamp, they had no idea just how much they would uncover. The search for Mike was about to turn into a race against time. Axel's instincts, his loyalty, and his relentless drive would soon reveal that this wasn't just a simple rescue mission. It was a battle against something far more sinister than anyone could have imagined. When Axel's paws hit the ground near the swamp's edge, it felt like a return to something primal. The air was thick with moisture, the sounds of distant wildlife calling out in the deepening dusk. Everything around him smelled different. It had been months since he had worked in the field, months since his last search, his last mission, his last time working side by side with Mike. But his body remembered, and his instincts had never dulled. The team watched in awe as Axel moved with purpose, his body as agile as ever despite his age. He was no longer the sprightly pup he had once been, but he was still a seasoned warrior, with a track record that no human could match. Axel's handler, Officer Harris, walked closely beside him, though his attention was split between watching the dog and scanning the terrain. The area was treacherous, and they could easily become lost if they weren't careful. The officers knew the swamp well, but even they admitted that it had a way of swallowing up people, both the living and the lost. The thick brush, the deep pools of stagnant water, and the constant fog made it one of the most challenging terrains in the region. The sounds were muffled here, as though the swamp itself had a way of hiding secrets. The echoes of footsteps seemed to disappear into the undergrowth, and the deeper they ventured into the swamp, the more oppressive it felt. But Axel was different. He didn't rely on sounds or sights. He relied on one thing: scent. Axel's nose led them into the heart of the swamp, where the thick fog clung to the trees, and the air was heavy with the scent of wet earth. The officers followed in silence, each of them mentally replaying the last moments they had heard from Mike. The distress call, the radio cutoff, the uneasy silence that had followed. Was he still alive? Could Axel find him in time? The team moved deeper, pushing through the swamp's dense foliage, while Axel's head remained low, his nostrils flaring as he took in the scent of the air. The dog had a unique way of scanning the world. His nose was a finely tuned radar, a perfect instrument for finding things hidden in the chaos of the swamp. And today, it wasn't just Mike said Axel was tracking. There were others. There was something about the way Axel stopped and raised his head that made the officers pause. His tail twitched, and for a split second, his body stiffened, alert to something. The officers exchanged a nervous glance. Axel had picked up something. But what? The first sign they found was a small piece of fabric caught in the brush. It was torn, its edges ragged, but there was no mistaking it. It was Mike's uniform, its blue color barely visible against the dense green of the swamp. The officers knelt, their hearts pounding in their chests, hoping that this meant something, that it meant they were getting closer. The officers examined the fabric carefully, noting how it was torn. There were no signs of blood or struggle. The fabric didn't look like it had been ripped by a fight. It was as if Mike had simply left it behind in his wake, in a hurry to get somewhere. But where? And why had he left it? Axel was undeterred, his nose still buried deep in the ground, his body moving forward as if the clue wasn't enough. His instincts told him they were on the right track. There was no hesitation in his movements, just a single-minded determination to follow the scent. The team moved forward, the anxiety in the air growing thicker. They followed Axel through thick underbrush, the air growing damp and heavy as they ventured further into the swamp. But soon, something else became apparent. The scent trail was getting stranger. The deeper they went, the more confused Axel seemed. The familiar scent of Mike was still there, but now it was mingled with others, scent trails that didn't belong. The smells were faint, but they were unmistakable. These weren't just the tracks of an officer in trouble. These were the scents of people who didn't belong in the swamp. Criminals, perhaps, or something far worse. Axel's body language shifted, a low growl rumbling in his chest. He was trying to tell them something, but it was clear that they didn't yet understand the full extent of what was going on. As they pushed forward, it wasn't just Mike's trail that they followed. It was something darker, something dangerous. Axel's sharp instincts told him that they were heading into a place they were never meant to find. Hours had passed. The officers were soaked from the humidity and the rain that had begun to pour in. It was a steady drizzle now, adding to the oppressive atmosphere that seemed to hang over the swamp. Yet Axel, despite the conditions, pressed on. His determination was unwavering, his focus sharper than ever. Then, at the farthest edge of the swamp, they found it. The clearing was small and barely noticeable, almost as if the swamp itself had hidden it from view. A small shack stood at the center of the clearing, abandoned, decaying, and nearly swallowed up by the encroaching foliage. It didn't look like a place anyone would choose to live. In fact, it looked more like a forgotten shelter, forgotten by time, and by everyone except those who knew how to hide in plain sight. Axel's body went rigid the moment they crossed the threshold into the clearing. The dog's posture, always alert, was now on full alert, his eyes scanning every corner of the area. Something was wrong. There was something more here than just Mike's disappearance. Axel's growl deepened. He could feel it. The officers moved cautiously, their hands on their holsters, ready for anything. What they were about to find would make everything they had believed about the swamp and their missing officer seem insignificant. Inside the shack, the air was stale. Dust covered everything, and cobwebs hung in the corners. It seemed like no one had been there for a long time. But then they saw it. A box, hidden under a pile of old debris. The box was old, but it was intact. The officers moved toward it cautiously, their eyes narrowing. Something didn't feel right. They opened it. What they found inside would change everything. It was a series of documents, legal papers, files, photographs. At first glance, they appeared to be nothing more than outdated records. But as they dug deeper, they realized the documents told a story. It was a story of corruption, bribery, and illegal activities that had been going on in the town for years. People in positions of power, local officials, businessmen, even some of Mike's colleagues, were involved in a criminal ring that extended far beyond petty break-ins. They were linked to the swamp, the poachers, and so much more. Mike had stumbled upon a web of secrets that was far more dangerous than anyone had imagined. Axel's instincts were right. They weren't just looking for a missing officer. They were uncovering a conspiracy, one that reached into every corner of the town. As the officers sifted through the documents, one name stood out: Sergeant Alan Rogers. Rogers was a well-respected officer, someone who had served with honor, or so everyone thought. But there it was, his name, connected to the illegal activities in the swamp. Mike had been investigating him, and it seemed that Rogers had been more than just a participant. He had been the leader. Mike had uncovered the truth just days before his disappearance. He had been on the brink of blowing the whole operation wide open, and now he was gone. Axel had brought them to the truth, but the truth came with a price. The officers felt betrayed. Their town, their community, had been built on trust, and now that trust was shattered. They had believed in the very people who had been working against them all along. Mike had known too much, and that was why he had been silenced. The conspiracy was bigger than they had ever realized. Axel had not only led them to Mike, he had uncovered a town's darkest secret. The officers made the decision to take the documents back to headquarters immediately. They had no idea what they were walking into, but they knew one thing for certain. They couldn't trust anyone. The conspiracy went deep, and every step they took now would be under scrutiny. The more they uncovered, the more dangerous it became. Axel, his tail low but his eyes sharp, stayed close. He had done what no one else could. He had brought the truth to light, but the question remained, would they be able to stop the people behind it before it was too late? And somewhere, deep in the swamp, the truth about Mike's disappearance was finally starting to unravel. The discovery in the swamp had ignited something in everyone who was part of the search. Officer Harris, Axel's handler, had been on edge for days, trying to balance his duty to find Mike with the terrifying reality that their search had uncovered something far darker. The documents they'd found, the web of corruption, and the betrayal were all pieces of a puzzle that had been waiting to be solved for years. But they were also dangerous pieces. The deeper they dug, the more they risked becoming part of something bigger than themselves, a force they were still trying to understand. The conspiracy had far-reaching tentacles, extending through the town's local government, law enforcement, and business leaders. Mike had been the one to connect the dots, and now it was clear why he had vanished. His investigation had made him a target, and those who were behind it knew he was getting closer. His disappearance wasn't an accident, it was a warning. As the officers huddled around the stolen documents in the cramped shack, their breath fogging in the cold air, they couldn't help but feel the weight of what they had uncovered. But there was no time to sit and ponder the implications. They needed to act quickly before it was too late. Harris looked at the team, his expression hardening as he scanned the papers one last time. The name Sergeant Alan Rogers stood out again and again. He had been a trusted officer in the department for years, someone everyone had believed was above reproach. But now, that trust was shattered, and that wasn't even the worst part. According to the documents, Rogers had been pulling strings in the town for much longer than anyone had suspected. It was no longer just about the missing officer. It was about a carefully orchestrated network of crime that had poisoned the town from the inside out. As the realization set in, a deep, gnawing anxiety filled the air. Axel had led them to the shack and to the documents, but they still didn't have Mike. The officers had found the evidence they needed, but they had to act quickly. The clock was ticking. The criminals they had uncovered weren't going to just sit back and let this investigation unravel. They would stop at nothing to protect themselves. The next move they made could be their last. The team didn't have the luxury of waiting. They knew that Mike was still out there, somewhere in the swamp. He was alive. They all felt it. But the question was, how much time did they have before those responsible for his disappearance found out what they had discovered? Axel, ever the loyal companion, was ready to move again. He had picked up Mike's scent, but now it was a matter of finding him before it was too late. The officers, their nerves raw with tension, pushed forward into the swamp once again, with Axel leading the way. This time, however, the swamp felt different. The air was heavier, as if the very earth itself was holding its breath. The once dense fog seemed to swallow up everything, creating an eerie silence that heightened the sense of urgency. As Axel moved forward, his body language betrayed the seriousness of the situation. His tail was tucked low, and his pace had quickened. He could sense something more dangerous than ever before. Axel led them through the thick underbrush, his keen nose twitching with every step. The scent trail was growing fainter, but he was determined. He could feel Mike's presence out there, somewhere. He just had to find him. The deeper they went, the darker the swamp became, as if the shadows were closing in on them. The trees loomed overhead like silent sentinels, their gnarled branches reaching out like twisted hands. The air was thick with the scent of decay, damp soil, rotting wood, and something else, something metallic, like blood. The team's nerves were on edge, and their minds raced with the possibilities of what could be waiting ahead. Was Mike still alive? Had he been moved? Or had he been left for dead by the people who took him? They had to act quickly. Axel had no time to waste. The search seemed endless. They had been out in the swamp for hours, each moment feeling like an eternity. The uncertainty of whether they were getting closer or further from their goal gnawed at them. The team was exhausted, their bodies soaked from the relentless rain and humidity. Yet Axel, though tired, never faltered. His drive to find Mike, to bring his partner home, was unwavering. Then, at last, Axel stopped. The officers instinctively stopped behind him, holding their breath as Axel's ears twitched. He was motionless, his eyes fixed on something in the distance. Slowly, the officers drew closer, their hearts pounding in anticipation. The moment they saw what Axel had sensed, their hearts sank. A group of figures stood ahead of them. It was clear they weren't friendly. They were armed. They were waiting. Axel growled low in his throat, the sound carrying across the swamp like a warning. The officers instinctively reached for their weapons, their breath shallow with fear and tension. The criminals, who had been watching from the shadows, were now stepping into view. They were a mix of hardened men, wearing camouflage and tactical gear, their eyes cold and calculating, and in the middle of them was Mike. At first, the officers couldn't believe their eyes. Mike was standing, barely able to stay upright, his face pale and drawn with exhaustion. His hands were bound tightly behind his back, and his legs shook as he struggled to maintain his balance. But his eyes were alive. He was still there, still fighting. One of the men, Sergeant Rogers, stepped forward. He was the leader, the one who had orchestrated everything, the one who had set up the entire operation. And now, he was standing in front of the officers, his face cold and hard, with a twisted smile that barely reached his eyes. "So you found him," Rogers said, his voice dripping with mock sympathy. "It's a little too late, don't you think?" The officers' hearts were pounding, their minds racing. The scene before them was almost surreal. Mike was standing there, but what was left of him? How much had he suffered? And was it too late to save him? Rogers, smug and confident, continued. Mike was getting too close to the truth. He was a good cop, no doubt. But sometimes, good cops get in the way, and when they do, they need to be dealt with. The words hit like a slap to the face. Mike had been working on something much bigger than a simple case. He had uncovered the heart of the conspiracy, and now here it was. The truth that had been hidden for so long, now in front of them, in the flesh. The tension in the air was palpable. The officers and Axel were outnumbered and outgunned, but they had one advantage: Axel. The K9 was ready to spring into action. His muscles were taut, his growl reverberating in the silence. The officers exchanged a glance, a silent understanding passing between them. There was no way out of this without a fight. In a split second, Axel leaped forward, his sharp teeth snapping in the air as he aimed directly for Rogers. The officers followed, drawing their weapons, and the fight erupted in a blur of movement. Axel was relentless. His body was a blur as he charged the men, his teeth sinking into the first criminal's arm. The man screamed in pain, but Axel didn't stop. He tore into him again, forcing the criminals to scatter. The officers moved quickly, covering Axel's back as they engaged in a firefight with the others. The swamp was filled with the sound of gunshots, the crackling of branches as they were torn apart by the chaos. The smell of gunpowder mixed with the swamp's musty scent, adding to the sensory overload. Axel was everywhere, flanking, attacking, defending, his loyalty to Mike shining through in every movement. As the fight raged on, the officers gained ground. They took down one criminal after another, their movements fast and decisive. The tide was turning, but it wasn't over. Rogers was still there, standing off to the side, watching the chaos unfold with a twisted grin. But even he couldn't ignore the sound of reinforcements approaching. The officers knew they couldn't stay much longer. They needed to get Mike out. The officers rushed to Mike's side, cutting through his restraints and pulling him to safety. His eyes were filled with a mixture of gratitude and pain, and he leaned heavily on the officers as they began to retreat. But there was no stopping now. They had to move. As they backed away from the swamp, the sound of helicopters grew louder. The authorities were closing in, but the real victory was in their hands. Mike was alive. The town's darkest secrets were about to be exposed, and Axel had played the most critical role in bringing them all to light. The battle was over, but the scars of what had been uncovered would last forever. The investigation into Sergeant Rogers and the rest of the criminal network would go on for weeks, but the town of Rockford was never going to be the same. Mike's near-death experience had shaken the very foundation of the community. The conspiracy that had been running unchecked for years was now exposed, and it had changed everything. As for Axel, he had done what no one else could. He had brought Mike back. He had exposed the truth. The bond between Axel and Mike, forged through years of service, had proven unbreakable. Axel was not just a retired dog. He was a hero, and the town of Rockford would never forget it. As the dust settled, the air in the swamp grew eerily quiet. The gunfire had stopped, the criminals neutralized, and the officers stood in a tense but relieved silence. The chaos had passed, but the weight of what had happened was far from over. Axel, the retired K9 who had once served beside Officer Mike Daniels, stood by his side, his protective stance unwavering even as the situation calmed. The once bustling swamp, filled with tension and terror, was now only marked by the damp air and the sound of water trickling in the distance. Mike's hands were still shaking from the pain of the restraints that had bound him for so long. His body ached from days without food, sleep, and the trauma of being held captive by the very people he had once trusted. But despite the exhaustion, there was a flicker of hope in his eyes. Hope not just for his survival, but for the truth that would now come to light. As the officers helped Mike out of the swamp and into safety, there was a sense of finality in the air. They had rescued him, yes, but they had also uncovered something much darker than anyone could have imagined. Mike's life had been saved, but the town of Rockford had just witnessed its darkest secret revealed. The conspiracy that had been festering beneath the surface for so long was now exposed. The grip of corruption that had kept the town under control for years was finally broken. The people who had been involved in these illicit activities, the ones who thought they were untouchable, had been exposed, their secrets laid bare for everyone to see. For Mike, the pain of what had happened, the betrayal, the long days of captivity, the knowledge that his colleagues and friends were part of something so horrific, was not something he could easily shake off. The scars on his body would heal, but the scars on his soul would take much longer. But at least, for the moment, Mike was free. The truth had been uncovered, and the justice that was so desperately needed had begun to unfold. The days following the rescue were filled with a mix of shock and relief. The authorities immediately began a full-scale investigation into the criminal network that had been uncovered in the swamp. Sergeant Rogers, the man who had orchestrated the entire operation, was arrested and taken into custody. His smug demeanor shattered as the weight of his actions came crashing down. The criminal syndicate that had been running rampant in the town of Rockford was exposed, and many others were arrested, including a few high-ranking members of the police force who had been complicit in the operation. The town, which had once felt like a safe haven, was now grappling with its own darkness. The citizens were stunned to learn that those they had trusted, officers of the law, business owners, even local government officials, had been involved in a criminal underworld that stretched far beyond petty thefts or break-ins. The trust that the community had placed in their leaders was shattered, and it would take time to rebuild. For Mike, the process of healing was just beginning. His injuries, physical and emotional, were severe. He had seen his closest colleagues turned enemies, and the betrayal ran deep. But he was not alone. His family, the officers who had stood by him, and of course, Axel, his loyal companion, were there to support him every step of the way. Axel had proven to be more than just a dog. He had been Mike's savior, the one who had led them through the swamp, and who had sniffed out the corruption long before anyone else. Axel was no longer just a retired K9. He was a hero who had saved his partner's life and exposed a deep, systemic rot that no one had even known existed. But as much as the community's attention turned to the dramatic takedown of the criminal operation, there was one undeniable truth. Rockford would never be the same. The small town that had once been peaceful and unassuming had been irrevocably changed by the events that unfolded in those treacherous swamp waters. As time passed, Mike and Axel both began to heal in their own ways. Mike returned to his role in law enforcement, but his position had changed. His trust in others had been broken, and although he still believed in the justice system, he now carried a deeper wariness about the people he worked with. His experiences in the swamp had taught him a hard lesson about loyalty, integrity, and the importance of never letting one's guard down, even when you think you're safe. For Axel, it wasn't just about being a retired K9 anymore. He had found a new role as a symbol of resilience. Every time the people of Rockford saw the retired dog, they were reminded of the courage and loyalty it took to fight through darkness and find the light. Axel had not only saved his partner's life, he had given the town a chance to redeem itself. The bond between Axel and Mike was unbreakable, and it was clear that this partnership, forged through years of service, would be the foundation of their healing. Axel's story became legendary in Rockford, the tale of the retired K9 who saved his partner and exposed the town's darkest secret spread far and wide. And it wasn't long before the town held a ceremony to honor Axel's bravery. People from all walks of life came together to pay their respects to the dog who had done the impossible. But for Mike, the real honor came in knowing that his best friend, his partner, had always been by his side. No medal, no title, could ever compare to the unspoken bond they shared. The two heroes, Mike and Axel, became symbols of hope, resilience, and the importance of loyalty. They had both been through hell, but they had made it through the other side. They had fought for each other, for the truth, and for justice. They had exposed the corruption that had stained their town, and in doing so, they had given the people of Rockford a chance at redemption. But redemption wasn't something that came easily. The road ahead would be long and fraught with challenges, as the town's leaders worked to rebuild the trust that had been broken. The scars of the past would take time to heal, but Mike, Axel, and the rest of the officers who had stood by them knew one thing for sure: they had made a difference, and in the end, that was all that mattered. Rockford, once shaken to its core, began the long and arduous process of rebuilding itself. The truth about the conspiracy had rocked the foundations of the town, but it also provided an opportunity for growth. The corrupt individuals who had once held power were now behind bars, and the remaining leaders of the community took it upon themselves to ensure that such a betrayal would never happen again. Mike, though scarred, found solace in the fact that he had brought the truth to light. He worked alongside the other officers, helping to restore faith in the system, but he never forgot the price he had paid for that truth. The memories of his time in captivity, the pain, the fear, and the feeling of betrayal would stay with him forever. But Axel's presence, his unwavering loyalty, would always remind him that even in the darkest times, there was always hope. Axel, now a living legend in the town, would spend his days in quiet retirement, but his legacy would live on. He wasn't just a retired dog. He was a symbol of what it meant to be loyal, brave, and relentless. He had fought for Mike, for justice, and for the truth, and in doing so, he had changed the course of their town's history. For Mike, Axel was more than a hero. He was family, and together, they had uncovered a truth no one could have ever imagined. A truth that had exposed the darkness of the swamp and brought a new beginning for Rockford. As Mike and Axel walked side by side through the town they had helped save, it was clear that their bond, their story, would never be forgotten. The past had shaped them, but it was their future that would define them. And as the town of Rockford healed, the message was clear: loyalty and bravery will always triumph over betrayal and darkness. But this story isn't over. There are still more stories to tell, stories of hope, redemption, and the unbreakable bonds between humans and their loyal companions. If you enjoyed this incredible journey, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this story with others. And for more unforgettable tales of courage and loyalty, be sure to watch our next video.